Hi, we're going to talk about the myths behind the Aztec cannibalism today. So first, let's start by talking about who the Aztecs were. So the Aztecs originated as a nomadic tribe in northern Mexico and then arrived in Mesoamerica around the beginning of the 13th century. They're believed to have begun as a tribe of hunter-gatherers, and they call themselves Mexica. They were extremely religious people, and the Spanish conquest of their empire happened around 1519 to 1521 during the 16th century. And cannibalism in Mesoamerica was allegedly an institutionalized religious practice. And most of these sources come from the Spanish people themselves. And they describe the practice to be from a majority of slaves or enemies who were captured in battles. And the documentation of the Aztec cannibalism mainly dates from the period after the Spanish conquest of their empire. So the myth that we're trying to debunk today was that cannibalism was an institutionalized part of Aztec life that provided raw materials and also was an important source of protein for their food. And we're going to debunk this argument using 3 points. The first is that Aztec histories do not normalize cannibalism, which makes it less likely that they actually practiced it. The second, that accounts of cannibalism are actually problematic. And the third point being the material evidence for cannibalism isn't strong enough.
So first of all, cannibalism was clearly not a normal part of Aztec society. All of the sources that claim um, that it was a normal part of Aztec society are Spanish, and sources that had a better understanding of Aztec society, even though they had the same religious motives and the same negative opinion of pre-Hispanic religion, describe cannibalism less and in less extreme contexts than the Spanish sources do. And most of the times they describe it, it's as something shocking. And even when they do describe it as something normalized, it's done only by a small portion of society, not by most people. Um, and the Nahua sources describe cannibalism even less. They never describe it as a normalized part of Aztec society. Um, And the few times that they do mention it, it's as something bad. So, for example, as in a story when the Aztecs conquered a city-state and stopped cannibalism there, or in regards to a nomadic group which they saw as primitive. Um, the sources of claims of cannibalism are also very problematic from a timeline point of view, just because most of them come from after the conquest and after mass conversion had already occurred. So society was already very different from how it had been before the Spanish arrived. Um, the the ethnographic survey that contains references to cannibalism has these problems, and it also has the issue that people who were completing it might have had an incentive to talk badly about their previous religion, and they might have also just been going off of stories that they had heard because, as I mentioned before, it was like already around 50 years after the Spanish had arrived. And this is just to show that many of the other prominent sources also have similar timeline issues. These are all completed like around 50 years after the Spanish arrived.
And the final point is that there's actually a general lack of evidence itself. The evidence that we do have come from butchery marks, cooking, bones in mid-end deposits, and disarticulation. And all of this evidence can be indications of other activities other than cannibalism. For example, cooking can be shown as something part of the cremation process. The bones can be used in urban expansions, for example, in trophies. And disarticulations is also indicative of secondary burials. So none of these activities directly prove that cannibalism was practiced. Another point is skull rack. Skull rack was basically a structure that was used to display human skulls. These human skulls were connected to cannibalism to tell stories that these skulls were used as sacrifices and a source of food. However, the estimation of the number of skulls that were present in skull rack doesn't add up to the amount of meat that would be necessary to feed the Aztec population. And there was also proof that the Aztecs already had a rich and varied diet, so there was no reason why human meat would have to be a part of their normal diet. This is an image of skull rack showing the skulls that were laid out in rows.
Um, there are a few slightly more plausible claims of cannibalism, just that it was practiced. If it was practiced, it was on a small scale by elites in specific ceremonies, that it was in very small amounts, and that there definitely were stories of cannibalism among indigenous people, at least after the conquest had happened.